Idi Amin, the worst African dictator or not? This is Idi Amin. He was known as one of the most controversial and powerful figures in Ugandan history. What made him one of the most feared men far across to the ends of Africa? In 1925, Idi Amin was born in a little town called Koboko in what is now known as northwestern Uganda. Both his parents were from different ethnic groups. His father belonged to the Kakwa ethnic group, while his mother belonged to the Lubara ethnic group. The marriage didn't last so long, with both parents going their separate ways. He ended up with his mother, and they both moved and settled in Lugazi, in Uganda, near Lake Victoria. Aside from an Islamic school Amin went to till the 4th grade, he hadn't gotten any other schooling and just spent his days with his mother farming and living the normal rural life. That was until 1946 when at the age of 21, he joined the British colonial army called the King's African Rifles as an assistant cook. During his time as an assistant cook, those in authority felt like he was a perfect person to mold into an obedient soldier. One, because he was uneducated, which is a very important factor for colonizers if you know. And two, he was magnificently tall. When I say tall, this guy wasn't just 5 feet 6 inches tall, like the average guy. He was towering at 6 feet 4 inches, just like the height of those tall lockers used in schools and gyms. So Amin had started training with other soldiers after he was recruited. Then in the year 1949, he was sent to a KAR, King's African Rifles Infantry, that was located in Gilgal, Kenya colony at the time. His unit had been sent to combat Somali militants and later on Mau Maus in Kenya that year. And that was how he got his first-hand experience of war. During his time in the military, Amin had showed his use of strength, height and force that the British powers were nothing but impressed. He became a sergeant soon after, then a warrant officer, to a lieutenant, then major in a record number of years. He was rising very fast in the military world, and this had gained him large respect and recognition. As a few years passed, Uganda had achieved its independence in the year 1962, having Apollo Milton Obote as the prime minister. Following Uganda's independence, Amin was part of the Ugandan army and rose in the ranks from captain at the time of independence, and in 1962 he was promoted to colonel. Obote became fond of him, and he was made commander of the army in the year 1964. With both having an established authority in Uganda's system, they became closer and established an alliance. This alliance was not one to last though. There was already tension between the two, and it was actually all political. Obote's rule was moving away from the Western affiliations and British interests, which made the British not in favor of his rule. On the other hand, Amin held all that represented the Western interests, their doctrines, and was most especially loyal to them. Amin started making plans to take over Uganda's government, and with the power he currently held and the loyalty of a large base, he put his plan into motion. After 2 failed coup attempts, Obote became skeptical of him. So in 1971, on Obote's way to Singapore for a Commonwealth Heads of Government conference, he ordered that Amin be arrested on the basis of corruption to have him gone before he gets back. Amin knew this and wasn't arrested because on January 25, 1971, Amin seized control of the government with a coup d'etat, forcing Obote into exile. This marked the beginning of Idi Amin's rule. Immediately after gaining power, Amin made himself commander-in-chief of all armed forces in Uganda and gathered all those he found trustworthy to his side. As with removing the wheat from chaff, he began to execute those who were loyal to Obote. This included the Acholis and the Langos, who were ethnic subgroups in Uganda, and then Christian tribes as well. He then formed security forces, namely the State Research Bureau (SRB) and the Public Safety Unit (PSU), tasked with fishing out civilians who were against his regime. On September 17, 1972, Obote, who was still in exile from the coup, launched an attack on Uganda from Tanzania, a neighboring country. It obviously ended up being a failed coup. Following this, Uganda, that was home to about 80,000 Asians, with some having been given birth to in Uganda, were ordered to leave the country and their properties seized. This was quick to affect Uganda's economic state, as most of those who paid taxes and owned businesses were the Asians who were sent out of the country. Things like manufacturing, agriculture, commerce, and so on were put on hold with no one to handle them. This put a lot of people in starvation, but Amin wasn't so faced. He believed that this was the way he could correct all the mistakes made by the British. After this, Amin even broke all ties with Britain and other countries it had alliances with, like Israel. India, in response to the treatment of Ugandan Indians and Asians in general, also decided to break ties with Uganda. In 1973, the Soviet Union began supplying Uganda with guns, armor, and other forms of technical assistance in hopes Amin will be able to create a balance between the influence China had in Tanzania and that the West had on Kenya. Amin, just put the funds into his army. In February of 1976, tension arose between him and the Kenyan government. Amin wanted to claim the Kenyan districts that were part of Uganda before the British redemarcation of the territorial boundaries of the country. He claimed that these parts were fertile and served as huge income to Kenya. He couldn't take back the lands though, as then Kenyan President Jomo Kenyatta threatened to have Uganda's imports that come from the port of Mombasa, a Kenyan port, blocked. In June 1976, a plane called Air France Flight 139, flying from Tel Aviv to Paris, was hijacked. The plane was hijacked after a short break in Athens by 4 terrorists. 2 were from the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, and the other 2 from the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany. They flew the hostages first to Benghazi to refuel the plane, and then to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where they were now held for about 6 days in an old passenger terminal by the Ugandan government. There are 2 accounts to this story. One being that during the 6 days, Amin had promised to help the hostages. Another being that he welcomed these terrorists and even supplied them with various needed amenities. Commandos from Israel flew into Entebbe undercover for a surprise rescue. They ended up killing the hijackers and then escaped back to Israel with the remaining hostages and crew. After the Israelis had left with the saved crew, Amin wasn't so happy, and he had ordered the killing of several of the airport personnel. In the year 1977, Amin appointed General Mustafa Adrisi, one of his trusted advocates, as the vice president. Adrisi had his own loyal troops in the military and wielded relatively strong power and authority in the system. Amin became weary of him, so he removed him from his office. This made Adrisi's men angered and caused a rift in the military. By 1978, Amin had killed all those loyal to Adrisi that had charged him, but some had fled to the neighboring country Tanzania. He then sent some of his men to take care of those across the border. This ended up with him invading Tanzania. At first, he had stated that it was not what was intended, but he then took control of a part of Tanzania called Kagera Salient, a strip of territory north of the Kagera River. President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania then led a counter-offensive to recapture the land and then drove the Ugandan army who had taken hold of the land with help from Ugandan exiles. The war forced itself into Uganda, and on April 11, 1979, Kampala was captured, thus forcing Amin to flee the country. He fled with his family and a few loyal troops to Saudi Arabia, where he then supported the war in Uganda, and the rebels in turn fought for his return to Uganda, but they failed. After living there for a while, in 1989, Amin decided to leave the country without permission and flew to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he was immediately arrested. After a while of consideration, Saudi Arabia eventually allowed him back into the country, and Idi Amin ended up spending the rest of his life there. He lived a very normal life there, and he even became a fruitarian and earned the nickname Dr. Jafar. Idi Amin died of kidney failure on the 16th of August in the year 2003 and was buried in Ruwais Cemetery in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Idi Amin was known to be different things: a boxer, a swimmer in his youth, in which he had participated and won competitions. He was also known by some to be a cannibalistic man. He would eat his victim in his secret torture room, or so they say. And to some, he was just at most one of the dictators who killed people that opposed them, put people in prison at the slightest reason established as treason and just wanted control as much as possible. And to his family, he was just a family man who took care of his wives and children by working all day and then spent time with them when he wasn't so busy. It is undoubtedly that he was indeed a charismatic person who rose from nothing, was educated and working as chef's assistant, to a strong-willed man in the military showing his worth, skill and diligence. Amin had killed tens of thousands of people in power and never came back to Uganda to account for it. He had died in a whole different country without facing the repercussions of his crimes on his people and others. Millions of lives were ruined and several actions he took were not in anyone's favor but his own. Some believe that with all this, Amin has to be the worst African dictator ever to walk the face of the earth. But with this one view always comes an opposing view. What do you think? Was Idi Amin really the worst African dictator to ever rule, or was he just one of many dictators who ruled in Africa?